Welcome to our Beer U module on porters. The story of porters is also the story of the Industrial Revolution and how beer fit into and mirrored that culture and history. In the 18th century, porters became the first commercially produced, successful beer style, and they're still popular today. We'd appreciate it if you could grab a porter and join us in tasting one while we explore them. Here's a list of porters that you can refer to when making your choice, but please feel free to bring along your favorite porter on our journey, no matter which porter it is. The porter is a rich, malty beer with a generally brown color that is created by the brown, crystal, chocolate, or even black malts that are part of most porter recipes. Porters were first brewed in the early 18th century in or around the year 1722 in London, England. Porter was an early product of the Industrial Revolution that started just about the time that porters became popular. They also helped to fuel the Industrial Revolution as it kept workers and common laborers satisfied and quenched their thirst. The porter has the distinction of being widely recognized as the very first commercial beer style. It is designated as such since it was the beer style that first came to be produced in large quantities by big breweries to meet the demands of a massive population. Porters are named for common laborers of London, also known as porters. Porters fall into a relatively broad spectrum of color, ABV, and IBU measurements, but most porters will fit into these ranges. The basic color is typically brown to dark brown, often with ruby or garnet highlights, giving the porter an SRM of 17 to 35. Porters are usually clear, although the dark color can make seeing through them difficult. Porters start at about 4% ABV for the English versions and can range up to and over 9.5% for the stronger Baltic versions. And while porters are essentially focused on sweet malty flavors, they can range in IBUs from 18 all the way up to 50. The higher IBU version is typically the American Robust Porter, which has been hopped more aggressively than its English counterpart. There really is no way to know what a porter tasted like in 1722. The ingredients are different today, and the process of making a porter back then isn't entirely clear to us, but we can make some very educated guesses about what it must have been like. First, dark roasted brown malts must have been a primary ingredient. Black malt, popular with brewers today in darker beers, would have made the brewing process more efficient, but it wasn't actually invented until 1817, so it was not available to brewers at the time that porters were created. Porters were also at least somewhat smoky in flavor. Kilning techniques were still not terribly refined, and most malt was dried over an open flame, so the malt would absorb some of the smoke, transferring a smoky flavor to the malt in the process. The porters of the day probably also tasted sour or tart. They were often stored in wooden barrels over a long period, and it's likely that some or all of those barrels contained a good bit of bacteria that would infect and sour the beer. Porters were born during the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. Technology was beginning to change, and conditions in London were suited for the birth of commercial brewing, with large and thirsty populations of workers descending on London in search of employment. Most people that found work became common laborers, working as dock workers or in textile mills, machine mills, and other growing manufacturing areas. This class of workers was known as the porter class. With their large population and physically demanding jobs, they became an ideal target audience for brewers looking to sell more beer, and this profit motivation spurred pub owners and brewers to find better and more economic ways to produce beer to meet their needs. During those early days, London had hundreds of small breweries, but large, commercial-scale brewing was still unknown. Brewing was the domain of neighborhood pubs and inns. And in those days, London drinkers often consumed a concoction made by combining different types of beer that was poured from multiple containers. Each different beer that was used, or thread, contributed a different flavor to the final mix, which allowed a publican to control the finished flavor, and also to mask bad flavors by combining good and bad brews into one drink. It was common to mix 3 different beers in a drink that came to be known as 3 threads, and pubs all over London served it. Around 1720, perhaps 1722, some brewers in London started to serve a single batch beer. This single batch was sometimes referred to as entire or entire butt. The word butt was simply a reference to the barrel it was poured from, which was often called a butt. This style of beer eventually became known as a porter, named for the porter class of workers that eagerly consumed it. Serving a single batch saved time and was faster for both the publicans and the customers who no longer needed to wait for 3 different beers to be mixed. It was often sold a little cheaper than 3 threads, which made it even more attractive to busy and relatively poor common laborers of the porter class. In 1802, a book titled A Picture of London was published that gave credit for the invention of porter beer to one Ralph Harwood of the Bell Brewhouse, which was located in Shoreditch, London. The book went on to describe how Harwood created porter in an attempt to replace the more complicated 3 threads beer with a single beer that mimicked some qualities of 3 threads. Harwood's idea, in legend, was to blend the beer at the brewery, saving time and trouble for the local pubs. For over 2 centuries, this story has been repeated and widely accepted, but it is most likely false. Unfortunately, there's not much evidence to support this legend, other than the story written in 1802, 80 years after the purported invention of porter. Other accounts mentioning Harwood as the inventor of porter do exist, but they are all likely based on the 1802 publication, which has no supporting evidence. The true origins of the porter are not known in detail, though many of the generalities of the Harwood legend are obviously true. In literature of the time, it is apparent that porter came into being as a replacement for blended beers like 3 threads. References to porters begin as pub-blended beers started their demise, and it is fairly clear that the cost and time savings of one ready-to-pour beer made it more attractive to drinkers, brewers, and tavern owners. The porter probably didn't even need to be a better beer than 3 threads in order to be successful in those circumstances. This is not to say that porter was a direct replacement for or copy of 3 threads. Porter was a competitor. And whether it was Ralph Harwood or someone else, the idea of brewing a single, ready-to-serve beer was bound to come along at some time. When it did come along, drinkers embraced it, and tavern owners and brewers followed. The very nature of the porter is a product of the times and mirrors the progress and the mentality of the Industrial Revolution with its efficiency and economy. Porters were also a catalyst that helped to shift the brewing world into the modern industrial era. Before the invention of porters, London was home to almost 200 small brewers, mainly located in pubs where their beer was actually served. After porters became popular, the number of brewers in London started to decline, but successful brewers also grew much larger in size and were producing much more beer than they had been prior to 1700. Porters were the first mass-produced beer out of necessity. They came along at a time when the population of London was growing very rapidly and was eager for a consistent, readily available beer that was cost-competitive with other options. Brewers responded by making beer more efficiently. The popularity of porter and the drive for more efficiency made it possible for large, centralized brewers to profit by making it. But the more that porter brewers grew, the less viable it was for the local pub owner to make a profit making his own beer, and the pub brewer, once commonplace, became more and more rare in London. Other countries also embraced the porter. The American colonies imported a great deal of porter from England prior to the Revolutionary War. In fact, George Washington is known to have been a fan of porter, and his enthusiasm for them is evident in letters that he wrote at the time. After tensions heated up between the colonies and England, porter brewing in America took off, and brewers in the colonies began brewing their own versions of porter to fill the void that British import embargoes created. Ireland embraced the porter as well. Guinness started brewing a porter in 1778 at the St. James Gate Brewery in Dublin that was modeled on the London porters of the 18th century. Guinness plain porter was available to the public until as recently as 1974. Porters are often compared to and confused with stouts, another style of beer that porters helped to create. Stouts were once a type of porter. A strong or high alcohol porter was sometimes referred to as a stout porter based on its relative strength. Over time, this distinction largely faded as stout gained acceptance as a distinct style of its own. The key difference between a porter and a stout today is the use of roasted barley and the character that it creates in a finished beer. While porters sometimes contain a little bit of roasted barley, the flavor of a stout usually contains a lot of roasted barley character, while a porter relies more on the caramel, chocolate, or even black malt in it. This roasted character could be compared to the roasty nature of most coffees and is a common flavor in stouts, though it should not be the dominant flavor in a porter. Porters are not typically as dark in color as a stout and have more of a brown appearance in most cases. The lighter color can also make a porter appear to be more clear than a stout. A stout's darker color can be apparent in the head of a stout, which is often dark tan to brown in color. The head of a porter is more commonly white, beige, or light tan in color. There are three distinctly different types of porters recognized by the BJCP, or Beer Judge Certification Program. Those types are the brown porter, the robust porter, and the Baltic porter. The brown porter is pretty true to the original porter concept. It's a sweet, malt-driven beer that contains plenty of malt flavor with a relatively subdued amount of English hops. Alcohol levels are typically low to medium. The brown porter is basically an English dark ale and can be very similar to an English brown ale or nut brown ale. But the brown porter is normally richer and roastier than the English brown ale. If you're drinking a dark English ale and you're not sure which it is, think about the roasty flavors in the beer. The brown porter will have them, while the English brown won't. Americans loved porters dating back to the earliest days of its existence, but in the 20th century, many American brewers started to produce porters that were either stronger than their historical English counterparts, or with uniquely American ingredients like American hops. In essence, there are two types of robust porters, the higher ABV version of the traditional brown porter, and the hoppier version, sometimes brewed with assertive American hops. While the robust porter seems to be much more popular in America, there are English breweries that produce their own robust porters. Like other porters, malt is usually the driving force for the flavor of this beer, with plenty of malt complexity and some roastiness, but some versions can be fairly hop-forward and bitter as well. The Baltic porter is the strongest version of a porter. It came about when Baltic countries started to brew their own versions of the porter which they had been importing from England. It gained great popularity in countries around the Baltic Sea, including Estonia, Finland, and Sweden. Today, some of those countries still produce their own versions of the Baltic porter. The higher ABV levels of the Baltic porter, which range from 5.5% to 9.5%, were designed to make the beer easier to export and transport, as it would hold up well over time. Another very unique aspect of the Baltic porter is that it most often fermented with lager yeast at cold temperatures. The brown and robust porters are always brewed with ale yeast, but the Baltic porter is almost always brewed as a lager. The flavors of the Baltic porter are dominated by complex malts that provide sweetness with dark fruit flavors, caramel, and toffee. It also typically has a roasty flavor that is distinct but not as strong as the roasty flavors found in many stouts. Porters work well in a standard pint glass, though I often prefer the English Nonic glass pictured here. It has a little bulb towards the top of the glass that helps to retain the head. Food pairings are abundant with porters, particularly when you think about matching the rich, malty flavors found in porters with similar flavors in food. A porter also helps to refresh the palate between bites where strong flavored cheeses and other foods are concerned. Basic pairing ideas would include nutty cheese like Swiss or aged cheese like Roquefort. Intense cheeses with their complex flavors are often a good match. Speaking of malty flavors, porters compare beautifully with red meats, especially grilled and roasted meats whose browned meat character is similar to a porter's malt flavors. Porters also work well with many desserts, particularly where there is chocolate, caramel, toffee, or other flavors that compare well to the malt flavors of the beer. Congratulations, you've finished the module. Hopefully you'll have a few minutes to take the optional quiz that is coming up. Like I said, it's optional, but if you are taking a Beer U curriculum and need to get credit for this module, you'll have to take the quiz and get at least 70% of the answers correct in order to show this module is complete. Good luck!